and gas projects in Turkmenistan. He identified the construction of the Trans-Afghan pipeline, TAPI it's called in short, and modernization of Sayidi refinery as two likely projects where Omani and Canadian firms could take part. A joint Omani-Canadian delegation, including Yusuf bin Alavi, Foreign Minister of Oman, and Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister of Canada, called on Niyazov to discuss cooperation in the energy and hydrocarbon sectors. Chrétien is still an advisor to Bennett Jones, a Calgary-based law firm specializing in energy issues. In addition, Chrétien is international relations advisor to Petro-Kazakhstan Incorporated, an energy firm based in Calgary with major interests in Kazakhstan and the Caspian Sea. And as it happens, Canadian troops are fighting in Kandahar, the area through which pipeline construction would occur. In the 7 years the Canadian state has been part of the imperialist occupation of the mineral-rich gas and oil crossroads of Afghanistan, 26,800 Canadians have been deployed, and 126, or is it 127, have died as of mid-August. This is the most of any Canadian intervention since the Korean War. More than 400 have been injured by the improvised explosive devices, mines, rocket attacks, and direct combat. At least 1,000 have suffered severe psychological trauma. More than 1 in 5 Canadian soldiers and police officers who have spent time in Afghanistan leave the force with psychiatric problems, a number that has risen rapidly in the last 12 months. And why? Why? To prop up a reactionary, misogynist regime of drug barons and warlords. This is to say nothing about the devastation caused to Afghanistan and its people. Nearly 8,000 Afghan civilians have died from insurgent and foreign military action. 50 to 60% killed directly by NATO forces. In addition, up to 20,000 Afghan civilians died as a consequence of displacement, of starvation, of disease, exposure, lack of medical treatment, crime, and lawlessness resulting from the war. By all accounts, the situation is only getting worse. Opinion polls have repeatedly shown that 55 to 60% of Canadians want troops out before the 2011 withdrawal date. The time has come clearly to demand Canada out of NATO, NATO out of Afghanistan now. The Canadian Peace Alliance, Council of Canadians, Housing Not War Campaign, Canadian Federation of Students, Greenpeace Canada, and others have joined forces to call on the Harper government to cancel plans for the $490 billion in military spending over the next 20 years. The cost of the war in Afghanistan alone is expected to reach $22 billion. The crisis engulfing the global U.S. and Canadian economy has reduced revenues for the federal government. The money earmarked for the military should be reallocated to avoid massive cuts to much-needed social and environmental programs. That money should be used to address climate change crisis, as well as to provide affordable housing, to abolish tuition fees, and to create a pharmacare program. Canada's exit from NATO has been NDP policy since the 1970s. But why is it seldom mentioned by the leadership and never, ever articulated during an election campaign? Let's begin with what is NATO. Since its foundation in April 1949, it has not been the defensive alliance it claims to be. Its members account for 75% of the world's military expenditure. 75%, with the US alone responsible for over 50%. Friends of NATO, including Israel, India, and Japan, spend a large proportion of the remainder. Since maintaining overwhelming military superiority is hardly defensive, then what is NATO's purpose? Well, let history be our guide. Following World War II, NATO served to contain the USSR, bolster European colonialism, and prevent any shift to the left in its member countries, particularly France, Italy, and Greece, where communist movements were strong. For the US, NATO was an instrument for the exercise of imperial power. It established US military bases and political influence permanently in Western Europe. Obviously, its NATO allies were useful in the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. But more important was the fact that through NATO, the US was able to exercise influence over the domestic affairs of member countries. This became so commonplace in the 1950s as to become invisible, but it is, in fact, one of the defining features of post-war politics in Western Europe. While the Soviet Union was the declared enemy, this state of affairs could be sustained, although not without difficulty. After all, there was a great power conflict and a real arms race taking place. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has become more difficult to justify. Attempts to build up Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and even Vladimir Putin as threats have not been successful. It is extremely unlikely that even the considerable resources being put into manufacturing the Islamist threat will be able to establish it as an existential menace. This effort is still underway, of course. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has become directly involved in military action. The alliance had earlier supported the Portuguese in their protracted colonial wars in Africa, but it didn't actively intervene. But it did intervene in the Balkans as part of the U.S. attempt to reshape the post-war Cold War world, its corporate interests. Although NATO's 11-week bombing campaign against Yugoslavia in 1999 was dressed up as humanitarian intervention, it was in fact a cynical exercise in great power politics. The Balkans had to be fit in with Washington's New World Order. With the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March 2003, however, only the faithful British government of Tony Blair was prepared to commit troops in what was an unprovoked war of aggression based on deliberate lies. Can I just
go ahead and finish?
A couple minutes? The war of occupation in Afghanistan today involves all of the NATO countries. A handful are more involved than the rest. Still, NATO remains a useful cover for Washington when the UN Security Council cannot be bullied into sanctioning the wars of aggression led by the U.S. and its closest subordinates, Canada included. This is NATO's 60th anniversary year. The alliance has dramatically expanded. Today it has 26 member countries, with 2 more, Croatia and Albania, about to join. This expansion is a direct result of the U.S. victory in the Cold War. And there are other countries that are involved in the process of joining, and NATO was intervened in such a way as to provoke the conflict between Georgia and Ukraine. The Germans and the French wanted to have nothing to do with it, but what about the peoples of the Canadian state? Is it in our interest to support an inter-imperialist rivalry to go wherever the Washington, Ottawa, London, NATO war machine decides to go? So this brings us finally to the tasks at hand. The NDP is a Labour party. It should be Canada's anti-war, anti-imperialist party. It's not enough for the NDP to oppose a combat role for Canadian forces in Kandahar. It is not enough to oppose militarism on paper while remaining mute at election time. Our task, I think, is to compel the party to campaign publicly, not only for Canada out of Afghanistan now, a position that we fought and won at Quebec City, but to prevent redeployment of Canadian forces as part of any imperialist intervention in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. That is why we must demand Canada out of NATO now. NATO cannot serve any useful, progressive, positive purpose. Capitalism rules by a combination of deceit and brutal force. Our task is to expose the reality of capitalist rule, to slash military spending, to reduce the armed forces to a disaster relief and rescue role, and once and for all, to put people before profits. Thank you for your attention.
We don't have much time left, and that's the reason the chair tries her best to keep speakers to